reducing and discouraging English fluency among Quebec's French-speaking population, but also reducing the numbers of native English speakers in Quebec. When you live in one of the non-Quebec parts of Canada, as I do, you often come across middle-aged English Quebecers who left the province with their families in like the 70s or 80s. And when you talk to these people in casual conversation, they don't usually feel the need to offer much explanation for why they moved. They usually will just say something like, yeah, I was born in Quebec, but you know, we had to move. And then the other English Canadian he is talking to will always just be like, oh yeah. Because to us, the situation seems very obvious. The writer Mordecai Richler, who is perhaps the most famous English Quebecer of the 20th century, summed up the situation this way.
It's a kind of genteel ethnic cleansing because about 250,000 English-speaking people have left in the last 15 years.
So yes, the Quebecers deliberately remade their province in such a way that it would resemble the rest of Canada as little as possible. But the other way they cut ties was through the business that Thomas talks about, which was the breaking of ties to French Canadians in other parts of Canada. Because Quebec's leadership during the late 20th century really wanted Quebecers to be, maîtres chez nous, or masters of their own house, their interest in fighting for French-Canadian rights elsewhere in the country declined rapidly. Because why should Quebecers care about French-speaking people in Saskatchewan? Saskatchewan is in a different country, or at least it will be soon enough. Now, Tom clearly does not like this particular legacy of his province, and truth be told, neither do a lot of Quebecers. These days, separatist sentiment in Quebec has declined a lot, and even though the Quebec ruling class is still as hostile to English as ever.
Language tensions are brewing at Montreal's Sacre-Cœur Hospital tonight. Earlier this week, it sent out a letter to employees after receiving complaints about English on its premises.
The hospital declined our request for an interview, but a spokesperson told CTV News, while this letter may have caused some tension, the hospital is only following the law.
They do fight for French-Canadian interests outside of Quebec a lot more than they used to. And when they do that, they mostly find that they are pushing against an open door because most of the Canadian establishment also supports the fight for French-Canadian interests outside of Quebec. Which brings us back to the original question. Is the French language uniquely important to Canada? In one of my earlier videos, I talked about how this question is very much bound up in what they call the two founding nations theory. This theory takes the form of a patriotic fable that Canada is like at its essence, at its core, a marriage between French and English people. Now, I reject this theory just because I do not think it is a very historically accurate way of describing the sort of country that Canada is. Canada's existence as a bicultural country, where the majority of residents were clearly either of French descent or English descent, was really quite brief. As I explained in my video on Wilfrid Laurier, the moment that Canada annexed the entire northwestern half of this continent in the late 19th century, the country was basically permanently transformed. Immigration skyrocketed, and the fundamental demographic realities of this country permanently changed. Over 2 million immigrants came to Canada to settle the Western territories. The immigration rate climbed so high, it actually increased Canada's population by a full third. In other words, Canada soon stopped being a country of just French Canadians and English Canadians. There were now millions of German Canadians and Russian Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians and all the rest. And then a second great wave of demographic change came to Canada in the late 20th century, and very much continues to this day, in which we have once again adopted one of the highest rates of per capita immigration of any country on earth. And as a result, what the French Canadians enjoy today is a form of, and get ready because this is a very trendy word, privilege. Simply because they are the descendants of Canada's first minority, they have been entrenched in Canadian law as the single most important Canadian minority for all time. A minority that we are supposed to care about more than the many other minorities in Canada today. In defending his decision to not build the French university, Premier Ford allegedly said this: "There are 600,000 Francophones in Ontario, but there are also 600,000 Chinese and 600,000 Italians." And in response, Premier Legault of Quebec said this: "I made it clear to Mr. Ford that I didn't like that Francophones were being compared to the Chinese or other cultures. I told him that we are one of the two founding peoples of Canada, so we have to expect services to be delivered." So in other words, even though Ontario's French minority is not any bigger than any of the other minority groups, Premier Ford is still expected to build them a university because French. And it's really not a much more sophisticated argument than that. By the most cold-hearted, rationalistic, objective assessment, French is really not that useful of a language to speak in the 21st century, particularly on this continent. It is a language spoken only by a rather small percentage of people living on this planet, most of whom are likely to be multilingual Europeans who can also speak English. It is not a particularly helpful language in the realm of global science, or commerce, or technology, or politics. It is simply a language that is important in Canada because Canada's leaders have understood Canadian history in a deeply flawed way and then crafted public policy around that flawed understanding. And if I may ratchet up the rhetoric a bit, I do think that putting such a flawed understanding at the heart of the Canadian state is really going to cause some very severe problems for Canada if not resolved. For starters, Quebec's obsession with preserving the French language and creating a perfect French society has obviously enabled a lot of xenophobia and chauvinism in that province. Immigrants to Quebec are selected in a far more discriminatory way than they are in the rest of Canada, and there is a great deal more pressure placed on them to assimilate, both in terms of speaking French, but also integrating into perceived French cultural norms.
Legault campaigned on a promise to expel newcomers who don't pass French language and values tests within 3 years. On the contentious topic of religious neutrality, the CAQ wants to go further than the Liberals did and pass a secular charter that would ban teachers, police officers, and judges from wearing religious symbols, including the hijab.
This causes a lot of tension because while this is going on, the rest of Canada is supposedly embarking on this journey to become the most diverse, multicultural, postmodern country ever. Prime Minister Trudeau once even famously said that he envisions Canada as being the world's first post-national state. There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada, he once told the New York Times. Okay. But as we've seen, the French Canadians clearly believe that they have a core identity and a mainstream, and their government is working very hard to enforce and defend it. This seems like it should cause something of a dilemma for Liberal politicians like Justin Trudeau, particularly since he relies so heavily on Quebec votes to get elected. But luckily, Liberal politicians like Prime Minister Trudeau have found a way to square this circle, and it is called massive hypocrisy. Quebec is just judged by a different standard because French. Let me tell you one of the weirdest ways that this hypocrisy manifests. You are now actually starting to get English Canadian white nationalist types like Faith Goldie actively envy what the Quebecers have, and as a result, a lot of anger towards Trudeau for not letting the English Canadians have the same thing.
According to Justin Trudeau, anyone who is against immigration is racist. Unless they're from Quebec, then they're worthy of his help and a New Deal. So a couple of weeks ago, Quebec's premier met with Justin Trudeau and presented him with an ambitious proposal to lower the province's immigration rate by 20% across the board, even as Ottawa promotes higher immigration.
The video actually ends with Faith Goldie wanting to move to Quebec. God, this is a strange country. Anyway, the point is the strength of any left-wing political coalition in Canada can only survive as long as English Canadian progressives just turn a blind eye to Quebec's obviously more chauvinistic and xenophobic culture. Either that or the English Canadian left just has to use this weird value system in which one very privileged group of white people are understood to forever sit atop Canada's grand hierarchy of minorities. Ticking time bomb number 2 is related and has to do with the very high barriers to political participation non-French minorities face in this country. I talked about this a bit in my video on official bilingualism, but basically, because Canada has chosen to treat French as this very, very important thing, to the point of requiring French fluency for basically any government job of importance, Canada's political system is inherently biased towards French Canadians at the expense of everyone else. For example, imagine you're a young Canadian kid born to 2 parents who immigrated from Hong Kong to Vancouver. You grow up speaking Cantonese to your friends and family, but obviously you become fluent in English as well in order to function in broader Vancouver society. But then if you decide you one day want to become an important figure in your country's government, the Canadian system turns around and says you have to become fluent in French as well, a third language with basically no relevance to your day-to-day life. I mean, according to the most recent Canadian census, there are only 70,000 British Columbians who claim French as their mother tongue, compared to 200,000 who claim Cantonese. In fact, if we add up all of the British Columbians who speak an immigrant language as their mother tongue, we see it dramatically dwarfs the number that speak French. 70,000 versus 1.3 million. It is and will continue to be very difficult to justify a political system that places very high barriers to participation on these people while giving express entry to these ones. Now, obviously, it is possible that a child of immigrants could become some sort of trilingual superstar, but considering that even the vast majority of white unilingual English-speaking Canadians will never gain the opportunity